My first memory in a linear fashion was playing out my yard, I think, with my dog and my sister, and being on the grass and looking up at the stars and having a real connection to the stars. In another fashion, it was not till 7 years later than playing with friends in the neighborhood and riding bikes. I had 7 years kind of mind wiped from the very beginning till about 7 years. And those were the years I believe I was under the control of, CIA and MK Ultra and Raytheon. So I have like, memories in certain timelines that are different than those that are actually in the linear. But I would say that was one of the first. Was I was like very little with my mother, putting clothes up. She was from Nova Scotia. I believe she was put into the MK Ultra too, and she was taken from me when I was 7. And then again, 7 years later, I do have more memories, or maybe 10 years later, of the same Hanover, Massachusetts, of the same sort of, my friends. I remember riding bikes, and there was also, people say remember me less than I remember them. They say, we didn't see you at school. Where were you? And so it's very splotchy. I'd have to like go by puzzle piece more than first, second, third. It's a puzzle piece, a puzzle I had to put together.
What were your parents like, and what was it like for you growing up?
Oh, that's a very good question. I recall my parents, they were Christian Scientists, which is a little bit of a spin on the normal. A lot of people are Mormon or, Jesuit, or there's a satanic or CIA. Mine was Christian Science, which I didn't perceive as a cult then, and I'm not necessarily sure I do now. So they were, we like Ike. They were super liberal, and we were very English. I will say that my father was very English. I have a strong connection, and so we were, brought up on a lot of English food, and he had a garden. We had, it was a seemingly normal, but I don't remember a whole bunch like my siblings do. Like as I grew up, I sort of have blotches of memory from mostly after they took my mother, which is after like 7 or 8 years old. And so in some ways it seemed rather normal, except for there was no doctors. If anything happened to us, what we had was called a Christian Science practitioner. And she would come to the house, and we didn't get prayed over. You affirm that you're perfect. You affirm that you are love, all the things that Christian Scientists believe. So that was a little different. We never went to the doctor. I was just reading the comment. Thank you. So that was outstanding, was the Christian Science aspect of it. Everything changed at 7 years old when they came and took my mother. And the strange thing was we never had doctors in the house until that day where a doctor came and injected her and took her against her will to the local psychiatric unit. No doctors ever until there was this collaboration, it seemed, between my mother, the doctor, and somebody else. And she was taken away. I later learned that's pretty much a big part of MK Ultra. They want to eliminate the loving mother because they can't do the mind control. If you have a safe place, if you have a loving mother, they can't split your mind successfully. That's one of the primary goals of MK Ultra, is to get you traumatized very early, and often by the loss of the mother. Even imagined loss. They'll convince you you've been betrayed. A big part of my book, I make a study of Princess Diana and her mother Frances, and how she went through the exact same thing at the same age I did, at 7, in family court. And that was very typical too. You probably remember how the British press, demonized Frances, and she was called the bolter. And yeah, that's very typical in MK Ultra, in the process. So I'm jumping around.
Jane, so most of my viewers have got an understanding of what MK Ultra is, but for those people who are watching tonight who don't fully understand what MK Ultra is, how would you describe it to that person?
I would say it was an ancient technique going as far back as Egypt, but was cultivated and progressed in Nazi Germany, in the concentration camps, as far as some of the survivors have testified, including Elizabeth Wallace, who knew both Hitler and Mengele, and she was also MK Ultra. So it's a process of shattering the mind to create alters. And they found that certain bloodlines, sometimes elite bloodlines, or in my case, it was very telepathic bloodlines, we won't go crazy. We'll split our mind into alters. And some, like Stuart Swerdlow, has testified to 2,000 personalities. And they do it under torture. And they learned a lot of the torture in the concentration camps. There was the philosophy of extremes, which they used on the soldiers in Nazi Germany. They would starve them and then force them, and then they would freeze them and then make them over. And so the brain will split under that. And so they started to do that after Nazi Germany with Operation Paperclip that came to the US. And so it's also a lot of sexual abuse is included, electric torture, waterboarding. It depends upon the target. And like, if you're deeply into the system, like you're a child of, say, Queen Elizabeth or the CIA or military, they can do whatever they want. I was probably another layer where they had to kind of convince my father I was just going to be looking at cards and telling them what the number was. So, and the level of torture or the method of torture can be a little different, but basically they're going to torture you until your mind splits into alters. And they program those alters for different occupations, like assassin, sex trafficking. They can use you in the military to send messages. There's all kinds of program they do to the altar. So basically they've made 20 slaves out of one, if they can do that many altars and program each one of them. So it's a method of torture that's very specific to split the brain.
All right, so you said your life was relatively normal then until they came and took your mum. What happened next?
No, I don't. It wasn't. There's a blank slate from about 2 to 7. My front life was normal as far as I recall, but that was about the time I was taken. There was white vans, Navy personnel circulating my hometown of Hanover, Mass, and they picked up some of them and brought them back. And others they picked up, they didn't go back because they were tested and they were found they would be sufficient for MK Ultra. And usually it's if you came from a telepathic. My mother was telepathic. She was psychic. She was very into UFOs, even in the 60s. There was the Barney Hill case in New Hampshire that, the couple that saw like 12. So there was UFO meetings she would go to in the 60s. So she also used to talk to me about Atlantis. She was the type of individual from which, I would have been born and I would have had some of the same skills. So I was one that did not go back. So I'll say the first 7 years I was being used by it, I believe, and I came across this later and went back with it, by Raytheon Corporation, who my father was very deeply involved in and got a lot of rewards. I think he got rather wealthy compared to the way he was from Raytheon, the military. And I figured out the military because, studying Operation Paperclip, and also because of my involvement. I was a reporter there was a whistleblower on the Navy, and they came after me with, both barrels. And so I was in the MK Ultra program those first 7 years. And I think they returned me to my family around 7. But that's when they took my mother so that I would be traumatized. It's called aftercare. They continually traumatize you in any way they possibly can. So you never hopefully remember the MK Ultra and the people who were involved and the people who did it. And that's very, very typical for MK Ultra, is you have the aftercare. And that, I believe that's the targeted individual program, is to make sure secret space program individuals, MK Ultra, never get to the deeper trauma. Because as humans, I think we address what's right in front of us first. Somebody's hitting you or raping you, or you're going to deal with that. And then eventually, so removing the loving mother, I think is systemic in that system. And so she never came home. And so I had no protection. Then I was surrounded by predators, and, it was just one demonic, curse, sexual abuse, everything you could think of to keep me traumatized. So I never remembered the MK Ultra and the secret space program. And it hasn't, they've kept me so traumatized that I've just begun to remember in the last few years. Because there was family court did me in for 2 decades. So I had to get over that. And then but it's all part of the aftercare of an MK.
Well, let's go back then, so we can stay on the timeline of your life. What was your life like then, as you were approaching a teenager?
Oh, so after my mother left, 8, 9, 10, there was a stepmother that came that was very abusive. Again, that's very typical. You're either put in foster care, depending on how they can navigate the individual. For me, it was an abusive stepmother, and then they moved me out of Hanover to Needham, which was closer to MIT, Harvard, Raytheon, and I lived on what was called America's Technology Highway. And I would move like right into the center of this MK Ultra through private business. And it just got sort of worse and worse. I got more abuse from relatives, male relatives, bloodline and not. And I was very abused by my stepmother. So I started drinking. I was sort of a little bit homeless. Needham was a very affluent town. But nonetheless, I was sort of walking around feeling very confused. And then by 16, and my mother returned, but she was with an abusive alcoholic pedophile, which they will often channel into women's lives when they're the most vulnerable. And so she was out of the scene by that time. So there was that's a very specific, no resource for me, nowhere to go, no safety. And that's really typical. If you go through a life where you find there's no safety anywhere with any relative, you've probably been in MK Ultra. So I sort of ran away at 16 and went up to Maine and was drinking very, very heavily and almost burned down a house.
Jane, one second, Jane. How did this affect you going to school?
I rarely went to school. I mean, I had PTSD, anxiety attacks. I was disassociated. I would go and then I would leave, or, I'd hop on a bus and just go around. I felt claustrophobic. I couldn't be in a room very long. So I hardly ever went to school, to be honest. They kept trying to send me to private schools and I would run away, or, and so I don't know, like, it's pretty amazing. I went to college. I went to UMass and Lesley College because I hardly went to high school.
Were you able to make friends as a teenager?
I did have a core group of friends. I mean, I think there was enough light in me that I had a core group. It was very strange. They were all Irish Catholic, and I was about as WASP as you could get. So I'm not sure why or how that happened. But in high school, I had a lot of Irish Catholic friends. And, I was always fighting with them about the Pope. I said, I would give him my position on the Pope. It says, even at 16, I knew the truth about him.